The challenge of transitional justice is, I know, something that our next speaker is going to be also talking about. So without necessarily repeating what Gerald and Anita have said, I'd like to hand over straight to Hannah from Swedwatch. Swedwatch is based in Sweden and looks in particular at companies, investors and authorities' responsibility regarding human rights, but also an emphasis on the environment. And in particular, looking at countries where high risks of abuses is a fact of daily life, and in particular in post-conflict contexts. So with this background, I'd like to give the floor to Hannah and to give us a flavor of where Swedwatch sees the opportunities and the steps forward of this report, but also where they see the report needing to go just that little bit further. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Flo, and thank you to the working group and you all for the continued engagement on this. It's much appreciated. Well, the question of linking policy to action has come up since we started our discussion, and I'll attempt to answer that in some way by sharing a couple of general observations before outlining thoughts on I think 4 selected thematic areas of the report, and finally ending with 2 follow-up questions to the working group on recommendations that were made in the report. And as a first general observation from our side, we really consider it extremely valuable that ample mentions of the term prevention were included in the report to make it useful to raise the report in multiple spheres of influence, such as those around the UN Sustaining Peace Agenda and Architecture Flo just mentioned, and as well as business and human rights fora. From our perspective, we also really welcome the fact that the report challenged the notion that business activities in and of themselves are always a good thing in conflict-affected settings. Not only because this does away with a major misconception, but also because it provides a valuable reference point for our partners in country, namely environmental and human rights defenders, who are so frequently being labeled as anti-development because of their critical assessment of business activities, concession agreements, etc. And just a quick side note, we'd be really eager to hear more about the importance of the role of human rights defenders and additional risks that anyone working on business impacts really face in the upcoming statement by the working group on human rights defenders, and of course beyond. Thematic areas I would like to highlight, the first one really is that call for strengthened interagency cooperation that's come up in the discussion so far, but also in the report at UN level, right? This is something that I've personally worked on for quite a while, but also as an organization based on our research and the consultations we've had, we just very much welcome that integrated approach the working group took in further examining the nexus between the UN peace, human rights, and business and human rights agenda, really. And as a positive example of this approach, we should maybe also refer to the recent Human Rights Council resolution on prevention, which included an invitation to the chair of the UN Peacebuilding Commission to annually brief the Human Rights Council on the work of the Commission. And we see real potential to replicate this approach to further interagency cooperation. And speaking of the PBC, the Commission, in our analysis, as part of recent UN efforts to focus on the prevention of violent conflict rather than responding to crises, what we would really like to see is the inclusion of responsible business conduct in discussions at the Peacebuilding Commission. And by seeking to address the factors underlying conflict, the root causes of conflict, in our analysis, its mandate really allows the PBC to take a holistic view of conflict. And we believe that a reference to root causes of conflict in, for instance, cooperation agreements with states in post-conflict situations can potentially provide an avenue for long-term engagement and dialogue on this. The second thematic area I wanted to briefly mention was the area of responsible exits. Based on our Swedwatch research and consultations, which reflected this area as so frequently neglected. We're very happy to see in the report the call on business actors to plan a clear access strategy in advance, assess impacts of disengagement, and provide reasonable notice to communities affected. Here, we would like to highlight that access strategies should always build on already ongoing human rights due diligence. And we would also like to add and stress that businesses should conduct due diligence before exiting, both if the result of the exit is a permanent or temporary shutdown, and if the result of exiting is the change of ownership of a company. Moving forward, we'd also like to see businesses go further in ensuring that they provide remedy for the negative impacts of their operations prior to exiting a country. And as always, these should be based on meaningful consultation, participation of those affected, and so forth. The third and another crucial area for us, thematic area I'd briefly like to focus on, is the area of trade and investment. Again, we really welcome the explicit mention of export credits as investment incentives in conflict-affected regions. And this is again based on recent Swedwatch research around the history of European export credit support for the coal sector in South Africa, which has had long-standing severe negative environmental and human rights impacts. And we also welcome the call on international financial institutions to prioritize investment involving responsible business conduct. We'd like to see further work done on the strengthening of the monitoring frameworks concerning human rights impacts in both trade and investment agreements, ideally leading to trade agreements being drafted in a way which limits corporate abuse of dispute settling mechanisms, which are currently frequently used by companies to hinder human rights and environmental regulation by states. And finally, two very brief comments on heightened corporate due diligence. In those paragraphs in the report, we really welcome the strong and repeated reference to conflict sensitivity, which we do see as equally important for business activities taking place in conflict-affected settings as for development and humanitarian activities in those settings. And on that note, just a brief reminder, so to speak, that in line with international standards such as FPIC and the Aarhus Convention, the results of any due diligence or human rights impact assessments or environmental impact assessments really should be made publicly available and accessible to the affected communities. And let me just close with two follow-up questions, quite concrete questions to the working group on some structural elements of recommendations included in the report. The first one being, could you just elaborate a little bit more on the international agreement that you mentioned in the report? And I quote, an international agreement clarifying risks, prohibited activities, and modes of liabilities with respect to business and conflict. And how would such an agreement relate to the already ongoing negotiations on an internationally legally binding treaty on business and human rights? And relatedly, could you elaborate on the format and target audience of the recommended multilateral and multi-stakeholder forum that you recommend to share existing practices in the context of conflict and peace building? I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And thank you for mentioning civil society. I think that's one of the points that's been repeated throughout some of our discussions around the centrality of those actors, not only in building the policy, but also as the frontliners to a lot of the protection work that's being done out there. Also, another good point that you make, you mentioned both sort of the prevention focus, but also the other side of that coin, which is the exit strategies, which I think are sort of part of, before going into in a conflict setting, the due diligence that needs to be made, or in a post-conflict setting, but also how do you leave a place in a proper manner. So those are two really good points that you make. Also the link with the UN peace and security pillar and the good practices that are out there and how to make sure that the opportunities outweigh the risks in terms of those kind of bridging and not collapsing the silos. I'll keep those two questions for the first round of Q&A. I hope to have two, so keep them for now. I know that Anita and Gerald may have already noted those down. Feel free to repeat those yourself, Hannah, when we get back to the Q&A if we've sort of overstepped those. I'll now hand over to Patrick, who works for Amnesty International based in the UK. And as a lot of us know, and a lot of their work on business and human rights has a conflict angle. And for having worked with Patrick, I also know that arms control is close to his own heart and work. And so I'm sort of preempting some of that in what he might say. But Patrick, the floor is yours to give us your impressions of the report and where it could go next.
Thanks, Flo, and thanks for everyone who's found the time and the organisers of this event, and thanks to the working group for opening up some space for civil society. Yes, I mean, I think that Amnesty, obviously, you know, we really welcome this report. We see a lot of interesting ideas. A lot of our work is to do with business and human rights in a conflict setting. We've done a lot on, for instance, extractives in the Niger Delta and in the DRC. And we've done a recent report on business links to the Myanmar military. But I guess what I thought that I would talk about is perhaps an absence, or, you know, a kind of area that wasn't dealt with head on in the report, which I think is significant, and it's an area that we're trying to open up, if you like, and that is, you know, I think the report was premised on looking at companies that are caught up in conflict or that have to be in a conflict zone because, for instance, if they're an extractive industry, but not companies whose kind of raison d'etre is conflict, who, you know, the defense sector, the arms industry, which whose real bread and butter, or, you know, a significant proportion of their business is about providing sort of military business, military products and services into ongoing conflicts, and also plays a role in post-conflict situations. And I think that, you know, one sort of element of the arms industry which is significant in this space is that the idea that the arms industry is not a remote provider of military goods into conflict zones. It often has a very, very enduring and intimate contractual arrangements with the, you know, parties to conflicts, and has large numbers of staff based in conflict regions that are servicing and, you know, training military personnel and overhauling equipment and so forth. So they do really have a tight tie. And I think also the other element, which is similar, and it's an area that we work on, is policing equipment. Policing equipment, companies providing and exporting policing equipment into unstable areas, is another area where, you know, there's an ongoing UN process which is looking for state regulation, but we would also see a business element and you know, a human rights due diligence element to that work. So what I thought I'd do is just quickly have a look at a couple of key and very useful ideas that the report presented through the prism of the arms industry, and look at how some of these ideas resonate with when we start thinking about the defense industry and that sector's involvement in conflict and post-conflict situations. So I just picked out a few thoughts, and like Hannah, I thought that the idea talking about the linking of trade and investment incentives and export credit with you know, the idea of heightened due diligence for business was a great idea, and it's an idea that is almost entirely absent from the state's very, very active and proactive role of promoting and supporting and financing the arms sector in many large Western countries and in other countries. And, you know, it's something that I think, because of the closeness really between the arms industry and the state and their kind of hand-in-glove relationship, it does, I think it muddies the waters in terms of their mutual responsibilities in terms of due diligence. The second idea, again, echoing what Hannah said, conflict sensitivity, I think is absolutely fundamental. But again, it's not something that defense industry really takes on board because of their argument that the state discharges that responsibility on their behalf through the licensing system. And that's absolutely fundamental to the way the sector operates. And it really forecloses any of the kind of business and human rights framework from applying to the sector. I thought it was interesting what the report said about the influence of companies over the conflict and the fact that, you know, companies really, it's very difficult for a company to be totally neutral in a conflict setting, and they will be on one side or another. And that obviously is hugely resonant for the defense sector. And in fact, if you think about it, it's absolutely necessary for the defense sector to support one side. And if they are seen to be supporting both sides, as has happened, for instance, in the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, which was a pivotal moment for the arms control movement, then there seemed to be, you know, absolutely cynical and amoral. And I think that, you know, if the defense industry could take on board the fact that they are active participants in a certain sense, and supporters of a particular side in an armed conflict, that would really sharpen their due diligence, their human rights due diligence responsibilities. And then I think the other, I really welcome the look at non-state actors and armed groups. And again, just looking at that through the prism of the defense industry, you know, it's absolutely fundamental. We all know that the main source of weapons for armed groups is the militaries they're fighting against. And we see this time and again in multiple countries, in Nigeria, in Syria, in Iraq, Yemen. And, you know, the companies, particularly companies that are producing and exporting small arms and light weapons, you know, have to be acutely sensitive to this very high risk, often in unstable regions, that their weapons will eventually end up in the hands of completely unaccountable armed groups that might have, you know, atrocious human rights records. And then lastly, and in some ways most importantly, I thought comments on sectoral exceptionalism, which were made about the tech industry, were absolutely also pertinent to the arms industry, because, you know, as I mentioned before, the arms industry just does not really at a fundamental level see themselves as covered by the business and human rights framework. And, you know, Amnesty has done work on this. We've you know, reached out to many of these companies. We've had replies from fairly senior levels of the company, and in writing, those large defense companies you know, have said that the way they see it is that it's their home state that is responsible for due diligence in terms of assessing human rights risk, and have said explicitly, some of them, that once their weapons are dispatched, they have no particular responsibility or over what eventually happens to those weapons, and it's the sovereign choice of the country that they're exporting to use them in the way they see fit. So there's a real cognitive disjunction there, and I think that's what we're trying to get out, that message, that, you know, the arms industry is not an exception to the rule, and they are covered by the principles. And I think what's needed, just to conclude, is more thought about, you know, adapting some of the report's conclusions to the industry, and more thought around, you know, a toolkit or, you know, some specific guidance for the industry as how they should be implementing the UN guiding principles and similar guidance. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you for also basing some of your remarks, and at least the big chunk of the second half, on the actual report's content and relating that to your first points on the relevance, but also the need of the defence industry to be included in this discussion and taking up its responsibility, but also to highlight the examples with which one could work forward with in any future endeavour in applying some of the findings of the current report to a different industry.